Now I'll read the gospel from John 6:56 through 69. The one who eats my flesh and drinks my blood remains in me, and I in him. Just as the living Father sent me, and I live because of the Father, the one who eats me, he will also live because of me. This is the bread that came down out of heaven, not as the fathers ate and died. The one who eats this bread will live forever. These things he said in the synagogue as he taught in Capernaum. So then many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, "This statement is very unpleasant. Who can listen to it?" But Jesus, aware that his disciples were complaining about this, said to them, "Is this offensive to you? What then if you see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh provides no benefit. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and are life. But there are some of you who do not believe." For Jesus knew from the beginning who they were who did not believe, and who it was who would betray him. And he was saying, "For this reason I have told you that no one can come to me unless it has been granted him from the Father." As a result of this, many of his disciples left and would no longer walk with him. So Jesus said to the 12, "Do you not want to leave also, do you?" Simon Peter answered him, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have words of eternal life, and we have already believed and come to know that you are the Holy One of God." Thanks be to God. And this is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So I've prayed for a word today to feed you, knowing that things have been happening in your church body. God knows that you've been in a state of transition with different preachers each week, upcoming denominational change coming up, decisions needing to be made, church members needing support and prayers. God also knows your needs as an individual and as a family member and as a neighbor, as an employee, as a friend, as a student. It's the end of the summer, right? And back to school time for families. There's health concerns abounding. Politics and news in our communities, our country, and our world. So we've been reminded earlier about our armor of God. So let's make sure we're wearing all of it. I pray that God would give me boldness to proclaim the mysteries of the gospels of God for the edification of all who are here and those that are listening online. So knowing all that you are going through now and all the things that you went through before and all the things that you will go through in the future, I'm simply here to remind you that God has sent you the very best, his Son, Jesus, described by himself today as the bread of life. Jesus was saying, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood. Jesus was saying, you have to chomp and chew on my flesh and drink my blood. It is necessary to do these things in order to have life and life eternal with God. Many disciples turned away at that. Was it simply how he said what he said, or, was it just too hard? That's what they said. It's too hard of a teaching. They turned away and no longer walked with Jesus. You know, before this teaching, there were crowds of people who had experienced Jesus' miraculous feeding of the 5,000 and also the unknown number of women and children. When he had the disciples distributing the prayed over donated loaves of bread and fish, remember that? The people ate until they were filled, and the disciples even collected the remaining bread that was left over. God had miraculously provided, and there was even some left over, which was gathered up. And I appreciate that none of it was wasted. But now Jesus is talking differently. He is telling the people that they need to literally chew on his flesh and drink his blood in order to have life. This, now, what Jesus is saying, this is different. He was saying that he was the bread and that eating him was necessary for life. Was he serious? Because that kind of sounds like cannibalism. You know, who eats people? Jesus could see that they were complaining and disgruntled, murmuring among themselves, getting upset. What is this? Where's that other bread? That's probably what they were thinking. You know, the ones that we didn't really need to do much for. We just sat and received. It was right there. It was easy to eat, easy to chew. Well, that other bread is gone. This new bread had come. Jesus is that bread, the bread of life, given by God to the world. Will you eat this bread? Eat me, Jesus says. Feed on Jesus. What does that even mean? What does it mean to chew on living flesh? Think about it. Like, recall eating once again. Chewing on Jesus might mean, well, it might mean you might need to smell the flesh, his flesh, and then to taste it, experience it, put it in your mouth, and let your body respond to it. Chew on it, swallow it, and your body does the rest as the food is inside of you. So I'm thinking about the time when my family and I visited Cambodia. Because, you know, we lived in South Korea before we lived and moved here to Texas back in 2020. So when we were in Cambodia, we got to a new city by bus. My husband was sick, so he had to stay in the hotel. But we were hungry. So my kids and I left out in the dark and was walking along the street to see what we could find. We actually came across a vendors on the street, and there was somebody grilling something. It smelled so good. We walked over there to go see what it was. I had my money in hand. We went to take a look at what they were grilling, and I'm ready to buy because we were hungry. And but when we looked at the grill, it was stuffed frogs or toads. I'm not sure which one. We didn't stay too long to look. But we backed up, turned around, and left. So that was not something we wanted to partake in. Even though we were hungry, we left. I wonder if that was like, or what it felt like for the disciples when Jesus was starting to talk about, you need to chew on me, right? And some of them, it said many disciples turned and left. They no longer walked with Jesus. Maybe they didn't want to remember all that Jesus had already done. That maybe they didn't want to consider that maybe Jesus was now doing something different, something new. But Jesus wanted more for them. He wanted them to experience life and life eternal. It was necessary for them to take him in, ingest him, feed on Jesus in order to experience this life. But they didn't stick around. They turned and no longer walked with Jesus. And I'm kind of reminded of, Nicodemus, right? Who also was confused when Jesus said, you have to be reborn again. And he was like, what are you talking about? How can a person go back into their mother's womb? Remember that? So, but Nicodemus stuck around, though, to figure it out. He stuck around with God. So Jesus wasn't surprised by these disciples who left. He knew that some of them did not believe. In fact, he knew from the very beginning who they were and who would betray him. And yet he treated them all the same. He offered them all the same. He offered them the best that he had, which was himself. Jesus said that the Father chooses and gives them to Jesus. Jesus says, I never turn away from those that the Father has given me. So the question I had as I chewed on this myself was, well, how does this even work? Do I not choose at all? Or do I choose a little bit? Is it all 100% up to God that I would come to know and to believe? There are different views out there, and that's actually not discussed right here in this part of the text. But what is mentioned here is that the Father knows those who will turn away. And it says to eat Jesus. But when I eat Jesus and Jesus is then in me, then I imagine that maybe what it's like is, that saying, you are what you eat. Maybe as I eat Jesus, I start to become more and more like Jesus. I would begin to want what Jesus wants if I'm filled with the diet of Jesus. Jesus offered himself up to the world as the bread of life for all to eat and enjoy and to have and to live life eternal. So as a person who's filled up with Jesus, chewing on him regularly, I think I would be prayerful to God about the other people out there, that they would perhaps see my life and see how affected I am by this diet of Jesus. Perhaps like flamingos, right? Whose feathers change to bright pink color because of their diet of shrimp. And I didn't fact check that. I don't know if that's actually true. That's what I heard. I don't know. But it's kind of like that idea, if it's not true, that idea. They eat so much shrimp, they turn pink. I don't know. We want it to become evident to others around us that we're feeding on God. That our aroma would be sweet, would draw people in. There would be fruit in our lives that they could see and enjoy. People will taste and see that indeed the Lord is good as they interact with us. Others will come to want to eat Jesus too. Because I have been feeding on Jesus, I will begin to care more and more about others. That I would pray to God that God would bring them in. I would pray and work to help loved ones and others that we are praying for, both inside and outside the church, to taste Jesus. I will be concerned over our neighborhood and our workplaces and for strangers on the street. Feeding on a diet of Jesus would affect me. It would transform my life. I would want to give, like Jesus gave, my very own self so that others could experience life too, and life eternal. God is calling us to something deeper than just passively receiving bread, but to actively chew on the living bread. Jesus is calling us to recognize him as the bread of life, sent by God to a hungry world. To you and to me and to those we see and even to those we don't see. Jesus invites us to chew on him so that we could all experience life and life eternal with God. So what are you going to do? Jesus asked the 12 disciples so far have remained, although remember, many other disciples had turned and left. Jesus asked them, "Are you leaving too?" Likewise, I think we're confronted as well sometimes through experiences in our life. Will we turn away too? Peter answers for the 12, saying, who else will we go to? You are the one who has the word of spirit and life, and we have come to know and to believe that you are the Holy One of God. That's what he says. You see, when he said come to know and come to believe, those verbs right there, it's actually written in the perfect present tense. It means it happened before and it's still happening now. It's ongoing. Peter was saying, we're here. We're still here. We're going to still be here. That's what he was saying in that moment. They were committed. They trusted Jesus enough to continue. They're continuing to engage in acts of faith, acts of belief, acts of trust in God and with God. And we know that this moment doesn't last forever, right? Because Peter, the one that just said that, all that, Peter was the one a little later on who would eventually deny that he even knew Jesus 3 times before others once Jesus got arrested. So, I mean, this is an ongoing journey of feeding on Jesus, just staying. And it's not about being perfect because, we all wrestle and are confronted with different things that cause us to re-examine and to question and for him to be scared. That's normal. God knows that. And God continues to invite Peter and us to feed on him. Jesus is saying, I'm going to need you to really get in there and chew on me because I am the living bread, the bread of life. It is necessary for you to eat me. It is necessary for you to feed on me so that you may have life now and life eternal with God. So what might that look like? What might it look like? So as I've been chewing on Jesus over these years, and I'll explain a little bit about how I have been doing this, but I'd like you to reflect on how you've been feeding on Jesus over your years or times of knowing God. So for me, I've expanded my conversations and learned how to include those that think differently than me. I've listened with humility, recognizing that I don't know everything, and using discernment with the Spirit and prayer to God for help to see others as Jesus sees them, recognizing that they too are created in the image of God, to treat them with dignity and respect, even though they hold on to differing views. For example, I've learned more about immigration and migration, exploring what does loving our neighbor really mean? And what does God say about caring for the foreigner among you? Chewing on Jesus in my everyday life. I've listened to others share their stories with me about growing up with racist parents and frustration that their world is so different now than when they grew up, back when they grew up. I've listened to that, and their woes about times are changing. So from those unexpected and shocking conversations which kind of sometimes come up out of the blue, I have brought that to God and chewed on it with him because, the reality is sometimes it's just tough. But I had a choice. I could have turned away. But instead I brought it back to God. Together, God and all of these things that are going on in day-to-day life and in the world, I'm chewing on it. It takes time, it's tough, it's slow, but we're together in this. I think that's what God invites us to. In all of these areas, What does it mean to have and protect religious freedom in my work as a hospital chaplain and as a Christian? What does it mean? How do I treat people? How do I respond? This is ongoing chewing between me and God, and I think God invites himself to everyone. Feeding on Jesus is definitely not mundane. It's not the everyday the same thing. There's plenty to chew on with God. And as I feed on Jesus, I realize that Jesus giving himself up as bread of life wasn't just for me to enjoy alone, but for all of us. And how can we help others to give Jesus a try? That others would want to feed on Jesus too, and more regularly. How can we pray to God for others that they would come to know and believe that Jesus is the Holy One of God? So I'm not living, Jesus says, I'm not the living bread just for you or for me, right? There's a hungry world out there. So have you been feeding on Jesus, the bread of life? Because it's time, I believe it's time, to move on from milk to solid food, right? We need to do this. Jesus needs us to do this, to eat him so that others may enjoy as well.